Paper 6 is going to be a self-evaluation paper. So you are going to look back over the papers that you wrote from the beginning of this class to what you did with your last research paper. And I need you to pick, let's say, three major areas where you learned something about writing research for the components of our course. So what I want you to be able to do is to really probably set it up with an introduction. Not going to be really a thesis in here. You're just going to establish that there's 3 areas of learning, right, that you came away from. And then your body paragraphs will be each of the 3 areas, and then a quick conclusion to say that you learned something. All right. Those 3 areas are going to be relevant to the objectives that we established in the course. In other words, you will have plenty of opportunities to write about things such as unity, coherence, grammar, diction, the presentation of research, or information literacy, like the 6 main objectives of the course, right? Those things are important. But in addition to that, I guess what you should be thinking about is how would you write about those individual things? For example, right, if you're writing about unification, well, in order to unify something, that's a pretty standard process of establishing a thesis and then looking at all the body paragraphs and making sure that all the evidence is backing up that thesis. Well, if you're writing about that, that's a pretty rudimentary process to write about, right? I didn't have a thesis, therefore my paragraphs didn't know what they were talking about, right? That kind of thing. What I'm thinking more about is, did you have a reasonable thesis? In other words, did you have something that could be argued? Or did you have something that was leading the paragraphs or the evidence to a more challenging type of argument? That may be more about the rudimentary process, and maybe less about the rudimentary process and more about kind of critical thinking, right? Were you able to establish a thesis, and were you able to establish paragraphs and evidence that were be able to back up that thesis? For example, in paper number 1, right, we're talking about whether intercessory prayer it should be accepted or not, right? If you've got a thesis like that, I mean, did you provide the kind of reasoning in the body paragraphs that would demonstrate whether that should be accepted or not? Right? So it's more about the critical thinking component and less about whether you had a thesis or didn't have a thesis. Think about the issue of coherence, right? I mean, obviously we know a lot about coherence in the sense that you can't just make breaks in the middle of your paragraphs. You can't just start talking about something else right in the middle of a sentence, or in between sentences just shift gears and start talking about something completely different. But what builds coherence is your ability to understand the process of argument, how you deliver that information, right? So in order to deliver that information, we have to understand how information is managed. So this takes you right back to those different types of sentences and creating different types of introductory elements in sentences for continuity and flow, right? I mean, one of the things I keep writing in these papers for a lot of people who struggled with this assignment was the lack of sentence variation, right? That I found a lot of people didn't pay attention to moving the argument fluently across a paragraph, that people just went right back to that old here's a sentence, here's a sentence, here's a sentence, subject, verb, monotony, right? Or they ended up with the same kind of verb over and over again, right? That creates coherence problems, right? Because it's not managing the flow of ideas. It's not the information being presented in a logical and meaningful way. So for you to go through and tell me that you don't have sentence variation, that's one thing, right? So you could look at your sentences and realize that, okay, I wrote, in my second paper, I wrote 27 sentences and 20 of them were simple sentences. I mean, so what? Right? The whole conversation needs to be, where was the information managed? In other words, did the important pieces of information end up in the independent clauses? Were you moving information around so that you subordinated some things to others? Right? Were you doing the kind of thinking that needs to go into writing? And obviously you probably weren't at that stage. So the whole issue about coherence is, yes, it's about, can you transition from idea to idea? But more importantly, it's about how you manage the information, how you manage the argument. Think about the whole objective of creating professional diction, right? You can go right back to the verb-based writing strategies. And you can start talking about issues like nominalization and passive voice and using strong versus weak verbs, right? You can start looking at the verbs in your papers and start analyzing, what do those words mean? The use of there is and there are, it is and it seems, right? And then how those things don't have meaning because the pronoun has no value in those constructions, right? And when you're writing scientifically, right, you can't have sentences where words don't have meanings. Are you using the language throughout your paper that has specific meaning? In other words, are you creating sentences that have an action orientation? That's another thing. Do you know when to use to be verbs because those to be verbs are representing a state of being? Or are you just changing your verbs to avoid is because you know that Terry Berry doesn't like to be verbs, right? That's not a reason to do it. Right? Do you know what you're doing versus are you just some kind of trained dog that does things because someone tells you to do them? Grammar, right? Every one of you can probably write about the grammar rules. And with grammar rules come punctuation rules, right? 4 major errors, dangling modifiers, which is still a pervasive problem. Haven't read some of the papers, right? People are still struggling with dangling modifiers. Parallel structure, pronoun-noun agreement, right? Those primary and secondary grammar errors. I think all those should probably dedicate at least one paragraph to the grammar issues, if that's you, if you've struggled with grammar. And what I would suggest, right, is that if you hear what I'm saying, I'm looking for these body paragraphs to be focused on the objectives of the course, right? So one paragraph about grammar. If you've got several different types of grammar errors, both primary and secondary, if you've got like subject-verb disagreements, comma splices, and run-on sentences, and all those kind of things, well, then just have a conversation about primary grammar errors here, right? But don't have a conversation about secondary grammar errors here because I want you to talk about other things, right? So you could do, like, I mean, obviously some people are probably thinking, well, I could write a paragraph about subject-verb, paragraph about comma splices, a paragraph about run-on sentences. No, you have one paragraph about grammar, whatever the factors are that you struggled with, right? And essentially what I'm asking you to do is to, to look at the things that you didn't know, right? And to be able to demonstrate that you're not going to do those things anymore, right? That you know enough to be able to read for them and to be able to correct them.
Yeah, you're not ready.
And if you think also about the research components, right? I mean, obviously the presentation of research is, can you follow the manual, right? So I don't really want anybody talking about how to follow the AMA manual. Well, I put a period on the inside of my colon, or I'm sorry, my citation, or my outside of my citation when it should have been inside, right? That's rudimentary, right? I'm not asking you to do that. What I'm asking you to think about, though, is essentially, what those rules of presentation of research mean. In other words, how do you present the research in your argument, right? Do you know enough to talk about how, and this kind of probably would be a good transition between, the control of information and coherence, right? In other words, do you blend in your discussion of your sources? Do you correlate your sources as you're writing about them, right? I mean, do you present the research in such a way where it reads like an argument and not a list of summaries? So it's a management of information issue, but it's also a presentation of research issue. And the whole information literacy thing, right? I mean, do you know what the data mean? Do you know how to read an article? Can you pick up an article? Can you read it? Can you understand it? And can you then discuss it? Right? Because I'm sure that many of you probably looked at the, prayer research that was out there and said, hey, these people are getting results, so therefore I'm going to accept it, right? Well, not the results are unreliable, right? This may be a time for you to bring up a conversation about statistics or even looking at what the data actually mean in terms of standard deviations or movements, right? How the tests and measures are applied. Right? What are the kind of things that you learned from here when you were reading that research and trying to figure out what the research means, right? Where are you today versus where were you earlier in the semester with the research? So there's this 6 main objectives, right, which we've talked about a lot during this course, right? 4 of them are kind of ballpark writing issues. 2 of them are research issues. So this should be kind of, those 6 areas should be kind of the areas that you choose from in order to write these 3 passages, right? These 3 paragraphs. So when you write these 3 paragraphs, you're going to need to do a couple of things in each of these paragraphs. First of all, right, you're going to need to identify that you have the problem. And then, once you identify that you have the problem, then what I would suggest you do is you give an example, right? Or give a description of what you did. And what would be really important here is that you explain why it's a problem. In other words, because of what you did, what kind of meaning did that create? Or what kind of problem did it create for your reader? Why is it weak? Why is it an issue that needs to be resolved? So when you start talking about things like the presentation of research, right? I mean, if your paragraphs come across as being just lists of summaries, how is your reader supposed to figure out how to transition from idea to idea? If you're not correlating the sources, what is it reading like? Reading like an outline, right? Your job to make the connections. You've got grammatical errors in your paper. What does that do to your reader? Right? Your reader stops thinking about the subject matter and starts thinking about incompetence of the writer. Right? That's what happens. Why am I reading this? This person doesn't know how to make sentences. So explaining why it is a problem, that's going to be a pretty important part of this. And then probably the most important thing is that what would you do to correct it? Show me what you would do to fix that problem. With grammar issues, it's probably pretty easy, right? You had a comma splice here. This should have been a semicolon, right? Here's the rules. I need you to explain things, right? I need you to explain. This is what a comma does. This is what a comma means. This is what a semicolon does. This is what it means. We do it this way. This is how it changes. I couldn't hear you. Yep. Yep. So pull some examples of the previous papers of what you did, and if you want to put those things in quotation marks or italicize them or some way, I mean, that's great. You can do whatever you want in that. I mean, there's no reason to cite anything in this. If you want to go to the textbook and pull any of the explanations about grammar rules or anything else, you don't have to cite that. Just take whatever you want out of that, right? And just feel free. I know you can cite it. So if you want to just explain things out of the textbook, by, go into the rules or whatever, great. Go ahead and do that. Use the textbook freely as if it's part of your course notes, okay? So do that 3 times, right? Pick 3, and what I'm essentially telling you to do here is just I'm assuming you could probably write a 10-page paper on just grammar problems, right? Or on one of these issues. So what I'm asking you to do is just pick a representative sample or example of what you have got. You don't have to do, like if you've got grammar errors, right? You don't have to go through all the grammar errors that you've got in your papers. Like just pick one that was probably the most important learning experience for you. Right? I didn't know what an independent clause was. I didn't know how to join independent clauses together. Therefore, I had these comma splices or these run-on sentences. And now here's what the rules of joining independent clauses are. And this is what I should have done here. Right? That's the kind of explanation that I need to see. Show me that you can identify your problems and correct them, and that you know why you're correcting them. And obviously, what I'm talking about here is, writing this from a first-person perspective, right? Which means I did this, I should have done that. Right? That's fine, right? You're not going to objectify this in any other way. And then the conclusion, which is, if I had done these things better, I would have scored better in my grades or whatever. I don't know. I mean, just kind of pull it all together here at the end. These three things were learning experiences that helped me understand what professional writing is, does, means, making a better human being, whatever. All right, what are you thinking about? What are the questions that you have? In other words, if you're thinking about past papers or something like that, you want to throw out an example, we can talk about it, how we present it, how we have a conversation about that. You're thinking about something in your head that you know that you could write about.
If you can, and then at some point in the rehab process, the convention is that you would go.
Yes. Yeah, the dangling modifier. I would consider that to be a secondary grammar issue, right? That goes in the paragraph about grammar, but think about what the dangling modifier does, right? I mean, first of all, it's a grammar problem, right? So you have to go through and explain what an adjective is and how an adjective modifies a noun in the sentence. But more importantly, right, I mean, you can just say, look, this is a problem because I've got an adjectival phrase and it doesn't do its job, right, which is to modify the noun in the sentence. But you're explaining why it's a problem because as a reader, when you read that adjectival phrase, you're expecting there to be a modification of the next sentence, the independent clause, the noun of the independent clause, and you don't get it. So what's going to happen to you as a reader? What is this person talking about? Right? There's a disruption in the reading process. When that dangling modifier occurs, the reader's brain goes off track. I'm actually thinking about adding the dangling modifier to the 4 major errors and making that major error. You think that's a good idea?
Yeah, I had somebody when I was back there that was like more stuff.
Well, I don't know if it's such a major error. The reason why it's not a major error from my perspective is that I don't find it to be the kind of thing where I just like get hit in the head with a hammer or something like that, like a subject-verb disagreement or something like that, right? So what I'm thinking about, the pervasiveness of it is making me think we could probably make this work more as punishment. Right? Good. So,
Are the 4 major errors primary?
the 4 major errors would be the primary grammar errors, right? Yeah. So subject, verb, comma splice, run-on sentence, sentence fragment. Those are the primary grammar errors. And then things like parallel structure, right? Dangling modifiers, pronoun-noun disagreement, that kind of stuff. Verb shift, verb tense shifts, those kind of things. Those would be secondary because those aren't the things that derail a paper. But yeah, I mean, if you think about it, that dangling modifier it's a good one to have because it gives you that opportunity to explain what an adjective should do, right? What its job is, what that phrase's role is in the English language. And then when it doesn't do that, it disrupts the process, right? The thinking process. The reader's on track for doing something, all of a sudden, you're going them in a different direction. How am I supposed to keep focused on what you're arguing when I can't figure out what you're saying? Yeah, so then you just go through it, explain how you fix it, you just, hey, just change that now. And I, saw lots of people going through and putting, changes on there, but there were then modifiers. Yeah.
I think one of my things was like transitioning between the data to one that's one to the list, like if you say
Yep.
transition words and stuff.
That's right. So now, yeah, that's a really good thing to think about. So how do you do that? Well, that's about the management of information. How do I box that up? Can I summarize or synthesize that more? Right? This is about managing information. How do I lead into that? How do I, do I need to give all of these numbers and all, do I need to bombard my reader with a wall of numbers? Or can I synthesize that down and explain it better? Right? That's a management of information issue. That's a coherence problem.
So
Yeah, right. You're expecting a reader to just take in a whole box of information that a reader's brain just isn't going to be able to process. Right? So that's about synthesizing the information. It's about understanding the reader, right? Understanding how the information comes across the page, how it flows, and how it develops the meaning. And if you're just overwhelming your reader with numbers and with short, choppy sentences or lists of things, what is your reader supposed to do? Right? That's the explanation part. You're asking the reader to take in all this information. There's no possible way the reader's going to be able to maintain it. That's good. It's a coherence issue, definitely.
So for fixing that in the paper, do you want us to say, like, give it a specific?
I would give maybe 2 or 3 sentences and say, all right, here's the short, choppy sentence structure I use. Let's maybe provide a synthesis statement, and then maybe here's what I would do to provide transitions. I would take this information and use it more secondarily as a subordination. I would put that up in the front of the sentence as an introductory dependent clause to move this information to the independent clause because that's the important thing that I'm trying to communicate. Sure. It'll be perfect. Anything else you're thinking about? You're good.
So say my right is my side.
You can choose representative samples from any of the papers that you've got in your possession, right? So if you want to go back to paper number 1 and get all of your samples from that, great. You want to just get one sample from paper 1, another sample from paper 2, another sample from paper 4, great. I don't care. Just give me 3 learning experiences because what I need to know is can you identify it, explain it, and correct it. That's all I need to know, right? Give me the explanation. Show me that you've mastered. Even if you're still struggling with this stuff today, right? Maybe writing it out and explain it. I've actually thought about doing this as like informal writing assignments. Instead of doing the quizzes and those kind of things, I'm actually thinking about having people write papers about the papers that they wrote. Where you go back and explain to me why I've written all these comments on your paper about these factors. Because I think writing about it helps you learn. Right? But now you got to come to terms with it. You got to look up the rules. You got to explain things, right? If you don't explain it, then you don't really understand it.
This is like the critical thinking part of it, even like organizing
Yeah.
ideas here, so that'd be more like management.
Yep,
really
definitely. Yep.
Like,
And if and that's the other thing, right? I mean, some of this, the coherence issue or the unity issue might be critical thinking issues, right? Which is, I don't know what I was arguing in this paper, right? Or I just had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know the research. I didn't know how to make that assessment, right? But at the end of the 15 weeks, you know now, right? That's my goal. I care where you are today. I don't care. That's the reason why the papers are graded the way they are, right? The emphasis is on what we do at the end of the course because I don't expect you to know that stuff at the beginning of the course. I expect you to learn from those mistakes. Any other questions? All right, well, here's the catch. 25% of the class will fail this exam. And it's a pass-fail exam. That's all it is, right? Either you do it and do it well or you don't do it. 25% will fail because of this caveat. Whatever you are accusing yourself of doing wrong, right? Whatever you're writing about here, right? If you're explaining that you have some kind of problem, you cannot commit that problem in the paper. or you fail. "25% of you, just historically speaking, right, will do this, right? You'll be telling me that you've got this problem and that you understand it and that you know how to fix it, and then you go and commit that problem? That tells me that you don't have it under control, right?" Diction, that's the one that gets most people. Just be on guard. I'm telling you today, right? I'm telling you where the traps are. Have I never told you where the traps are? I tell you every time. When every paper I give you assignment, I always tell you, here's where the trap is, right? But people just run right into it every time anyways. Lemmings going over a cliff, right? I'm telling you where the traps are. Diction is the big one, right? Because of this perspective right here. As soon as people start writing in that first person perspective, suddenly all the formality of language seems to go right out the window. Don't let that happen to you, right? Still maintain the focus on strong verb-based writing. You can use personal pronouns all you want. Keep the strong verbs, right? Keep the active voice. Grammar, right? That's another one. People will demonstrate that they have subject-verb disagreements, and then to create a subject-verb disagreement in that short paper tells me you didn't even read this paper for subject-verb disagreements, and you know it's a problem. You understand why the paper fails if you do that? Okay. It's offensive to me to have you tell me that you've learned something and then you demonstrate in the same paper that you really didn't learn it. Right? That's just showing me that you're going through the motions. You're just doing whatever you can to fly under the radar, hoping nobody sees into the dark corners of your brain. Eventually you'll be escaped. Questions, comments, concerns? Do you understand what I'm asking you to do? This will only take you 2 or 3 hours to put together, right? I mean, you can whip this up in no time. It's very easy to write. Just make sure you do a good job editing. Right? Because that's the thing that's going to be the key to this, making sure that you're not committing the same mistakes that you're writing about. Yes? You have until midnight on Friday, May the 5th, and you don't even have to give me a hard copy. You can just email me a copy. As an attachment, don't paste it into your dialogue box, right? Send it to me as an attachment before midnight on Friday. People do it all the time. Cut and paste it into the dialogue box, and then all the formatting's gone, and squares and symbols are in there. Any other questions, comments, concerns? On Monday, when we get together, bring in your ideas, bring in your draft, ask me questions, right? I'd be happy to help you with that. And then on Wednesday, we're going to talk about how to apply for jobs, right? How to write letters, cover letters, resumes, those kind of things. If you don't have a lot to do on Monday, maybe we'll start that conversation on employment writing then. So I got a lot to say about that stuff. All right. We'll see you on Monday.